My name is Livia Davis. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at C4 Innovations. And prior to coming to C4, as we call it for short, I worked in the housing field in Massachusetts for about 14 years and did a lot of work developing housing programs. I ran a COC. So I've done a lot of the work some of you may be involved with. And since coming to C4 Innovations, a lot of my work has been on leadership development and strategic planning. And so what I will be covering today is the topic of management versus leadership. And what I hope to do is have some interaction with you both during the presentation. You can absolutely put questions in the chat. Any comments you want to put in the chat, please do so throughout the presentation. And we will also have a little bit of a question. And if it makes sense, we'll just stop in the middle if there are a lot of questions. We will have a couple of polls, and we also will ask you for some examples so we can apply some of what I'm presenting to some real life examples. So I am hoping you will be ready to share either some management or leadership challenges so that we can kind of look at making this content come alive in a little bit of a different way. Does that all sound okay to everyone? All right. So, Caroline, I'm going to ask you to share the PowerPoint. And hang on while we just load it. And I'm going to see if I can't see the chat as well. Okay, I got the chat open. Again, Olivia Davis. So we're going to have about 90 minutes together. And again, we're going to try to make it as interactive as we can, but I will be going through some of the content presentations to start with to get us oriented. Okay, great. So today we are going to talk about management versus leadership, and we're also going to talk about a couple of things around how to develop a good team and what are some of the dysfunctions of any team that you want to make sure that you address, whether you're a manager or leader, depending on your role. Then we're going to just get some feedback from you, and we're going to ask you to reflect on, what do I do well as a leader and a manager, and what do I need to develop, just so that you have some things to think about after you leave today. And then we're going to wrap up. All right, next. Learning objectives. I know these have been shared with you, but again, we want to make sure that you are able to talk about key management functions and key leadership functions. And we want you to be able to articulate why both competencies are needed when you are managing and leading projects or programs. Next. So what we do hope that you will do while we're together today is that you think about where you're at. So sometimes when we are in a learning mode, we might like to be in the comfort zone, but that really means that we are not leaning in. We may not be completely present. We may not, be kind of willing to kind of say, okay, what can I learn? Where do I need to stretch? So the comfort zone in the middle it's good to be there because you can, you feel like you kind of know what's here, it's kind of safe. And, so that's a comfortable place to be. Then there's the red, which is the panic zone, where you feel like you're learning something and being asked to learn something. And it's so new and it's difficult and it's hard to wrap your head around it. And we don't want you to be there either. We really want you to be in the learning zone where, it might be a little uncomfortable. You might be at the edge of your comfort zone, but that's okay. It means that you need to focus your effort and attention. And it's Carol Dweck, who is a Stanford researcher who developed this. And she really asked folks to kind of think about enjoying effort when you're learning. And she's the one who coined the terms fixed mindset and growth mindset decades ago now. And so the growth mindset means that we want you to be in the learning zone, so slightly uncomfortable, but not so uncomfortable that you feel that that is overwhelming. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. So big picture, when we talk about management and leadership, if you look at the work of John Carter, who did a lot of writing for Harvard and the Harvard Business Review, he talks about management really being about planning and budgeting, organizing and staffing, controlling and problem solving, and managing. Management is all about producing predictability and order. And leadership, big picture, is about establishing direction, aligning people, and motivating and inspiring. And leadership's purpose is about producing dramatic change. So if you look again at the details here a little bit more, you can see that, when you have planning and budgeting, it's about looking at, okay, what are the steps to get something achieved, and what's the timetable? And, do I need to think about how do I organize it? What's the plan? What's the action plan? Who does what? And how do we go about doing this work? And controlling and problem solving is like, okay, I got a plan, I got my people in place, I know what steps to take, but now I need to make sure that monitoring the results, and if things are kind of going awry a little bit, then how do I problem solve? What's happening? How do I define the problem that's making it go awry? And how do I look at getting it back on course? So again, the goal of management, big picture, is really about predictability, order. You're kind of creating order kind of out of chaos, because when you go from a place of, a current status of where you're at now to a new place with, towards a new vision, you're going to have some chaos, right? So managers often look at making sure it's predictable and there's some order to the chaos. There's a plan. Leadership, again, if you look at the details here a little bit more, leadership is all often about saying, okay, this is where we want to go. This is our North Star. We're going to expand our programs by, 50% in the next 5 years. And we want to make sure that we have lived experience at the center of everything we do. So we're going to establish lived experience positions at all levels. Again, I'm just making it up, but you're coming up with a big vision, right? And then typically leadership also says, and we're going to have some big strategies on how to get there. We're going to just some really big strategies in terms of, how do we get there? But it's not the details that a manager would do. It's really about kind of saying, okay, in order to, expand into another state, I need to hire, somebody who has good experience in that state, for example, right? So that's one thing about leadership. The other thing is that you want a leadership, when you're doing that, you want to make sure you're communicating that direction in words and deeds so that folks can see the leader modeling where it is you're trying to get to and keep repeating where it is you're trying to get to. And of course, you want to have somebody who is motivating and inspiring, because you are invariably going to come against obstacles, and they could be political, bureaucratic, or they could be just how do I, get the budget, the money, whatever it might be. You want somebody who can kind of motivate you and inspire you. And the goal of leadership is to produce dramatic change. So if you go to the next slide, please. And again, feel free to put stuff in the chat if you have any questions as we go. So if you look again a little bit more detail, so management differs from leadership in several ways, and as far as I know, you're going to get these PowerPoints so you can read this again. I'm not going to read all of it verbatim. But at the most fundamental level, again, management is focused on creating order through processes, whereas leadership is focusing on creating change through a vision. This is big picture. It's boiling it down. There's going to be a lot of overlap. Management and leadership is one of those topic areas there's been written so much about in the last 75 years. It's really been an area a lot of people have talked about. But again, leadership is about vision, management about setting a deadline. So maybe that's kind of a way to think about it as well. Again, setting direction, coming up with how to do the work, and setting a deadline. So management is about making sure that, okay, the boss has said we are going in this direction. We're opening 2 new housing programs. I am the manager, and I'm going to figure out how to get that done to achieve that big picture. Next slide, please. So some of the key traits of management, it's really about establishing structures and a plan. Again, deadline, how do I get there? What are all the steps? And a big part of management is also delegation. Now, delegation is a challenge for many managers because we're not always good at delegating. I know when I first became a manager, I had no training in delegation and I wasn't that good at it, but I didn't know it, right? And so delegation do's and don'ts is another kind of mini training that's really good to have when you're a manager, so that you're doing it effectively, and you know how to provide feedback and making sure that you're clear in communicating what it is you're delegating. It's all about, okay, how are we doing? Are we getting where we need to be? So how do I monitor results? And if there are deviations, how do I problem solve? Sometimes when you're a manager versus a leader in your role, you may want to use your title to ensure tasks are completed and to delegate responsibilities. Where with leaders, they might be able to inspire someone to do it because they're setting a vision, and a manager may kind of say, I may not, be as, charismatic, if you will, but in my title, this is part of my responsibility. So I am going to make sure that the tasks are completed. All right, next one, please. So because management is based on structure and order, again, this is what I was just saying, people may follow a manager because they have to. That's okay. It's not ideal, but sometimes that happens. Whereas with a leader, people follow that person because they want to. Again, this is not all, one or the other, black and white, but often this is kind of what we hear. And you may then say, well, I clearly want to be a leader. I don't want to be a manager. It would be much better to be liked and have people see me as charismatic. I want to be a leader. And the truth is, we absolutely need both roles. I have worked for quite a few leaders who really embraced the leadership role, who were terrible managers. And so they could set a vision and get people excited, and then the implementation wouldn't happen because they didn't have good managerial skills. Managers are essential. A good manager is worth their weight in gold, and you need both if you want to have good program development results. Okay, next one, please. If you're more of a manager in your role, it could be that you need to develop more leadership traits so you don't have to rely so heavily on your title or position. If you're more of a leader in your role, you may need to spend more time understanding what does it actually take to implement something that you're setting a vision for, so that you understand the process. Because sometimes leaders, if they don't know how to get somewhere in terms of how do you achieve it, they may be really thinking about getting to a result in a timeline that's unrealistic, or they're not sure what the resources are needed to really get there. And a key challenge for most of us these days who are either leaders or managers is how do you actually pivot between the two roles in your day-to-day work? Because most of us, if we are doing any kind of supervision or any kind of program oversight, we want to have both traits. Any questions about any of that before we kind of go to some of the kind of how to think about teams? Anything around this? How many of you are manager or leaders both? Any thoughts?
Thank you so much for the information thus far. I would hope that I fall under both of those camps and pivot between. I see one of my staff is on here, so she may have an opinion. But I love the way that you're breaking it out, and I really appreciate that.
Okay. Yeah. No problem. All right, so let's go to the next slide, please. So if you have a team of people that you're working with, it's always good to know about these 5 dysfunctions that any team has to overcome to really work the most effective. So Patrick Lencioni from the Table Group, he wrote a field guide and many books on effective teams. And one of the ones he wrote was Overcoming the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And it really lays out how to build a team that it will achieve the results it sets out to achieve. So how do you get a good team in place? If you look at this pyramid and you go from the bottom, you can see it says the bottom foundation to really address is the absence of trust. The next one is fear of conflict. Third one, lack of commitment. And then the avoidance of accountability and inattention to results. We're going to go through these a little bit, but I wanted to just at least introduce this pyramid first, because if there is an absence of trust at the bottom, it can be hard to really make sure that you get everybody's opinion on the table in order to hear about differing opinions. And if there isn't a clear way to think about some of the conflicts there might be or how to manage it, then you may not get everybody's commitment, which means that there may also be not a desire to be completely accountable to each other. and there's less attention to the results. So I'm just introducing this here because we're going to go through it in more detail in a minute. If you go to the next slide, if we turn this on its head and look at it in a strengths-based manner, you'll see then it says, okay, so that actually means that a foundation of an effective team would be that there is trust, there is productive conflict that goes on, there's a commitment from everyone, everyone is holding each other accountable, and we get the results we want because these other foundations are in place. So before we get into some of the details for each one of these, I want to just introduce the notion of a rules for the road, because rules for the road for any team is a very helpful tool to help overcome some of these dysfunctions and develop an effective team. So rules for the roles are also talked about as community agreements or team agreements. And it's basically, if you have a team of people, how do you interact with each other? How do you disagree? How do you agree to show up? What are the rules for the road for how you meet as a team? And if you go to the next slide, these are just examples. You would develop one for your own team. You could have the rules for the road or community agreements be, you know what, when I'm in a team meeting, we need to make sure we're taking turns talking, right? We can't have anyone be dominant. We want to make sure we hear from everyone. Or it could be that we really want people to stay on topic, right? That there are many important topics, but if we don't pay attention to the one that's on the table, then it can get watered down and we may not get anywhere. We want to make sure that we actively listen. So rather than preparing a response while somebody's still talking, you're listening to their point of view. You may also want to think about, how do we honor all experience and expertise? So this is especially important if there are different power levels in teams, where they're managers or new employees or middle managers. How do you make sure that everyone has their experience and expertise honored? And then if something is said that makes you go, ouch, because maybe someone used a word that was very negative, or they raised their tone, or maybe something was said, how do you address those kinds of ouches? And if you're not even sure that there's a way to address the ouch, then what happens is that that person may no longer be fully present because they're busy kind of processing the ouch and not fully focusing on what's being discussed. If you go to the next slide, the other thing we often talk about is that we want to make sure that we think about having everyone say what needs to be said in the meeting, not afterwards with someone else. And so this do not have hallway conversations is a rule for the road that we often talk about as really critical. It could be, if you're meeting virtual, that you don't have private IMs, right? So if you have something to say, what Patrick Lencioni would say is that you want everyone to say what's on their heart in the meeting and not to someone else afterwards. And I'm sure we have all been in meetings where we didn't say exactly what we want to say in the meeting, but we shared it afterwards. So the other thing they talk about is it would be really good to get out of your comfort zone. So commit to getting out of your comfort zone. Being comfortable, being uncomfortable is something we talk a lot about with teams. We also talk about, when you're with a team, you need to be able to build trust. And that means that you have to agree on what kind of level of confidentiality you have. And it could be that it's okay to share what was discussed, but not who said what. Or it could be some meetings that is completely confidential. Or it could be that most everything that is discussed is something that you can freely share, but you want to think about what is the level of confidentiality. And then lastly, for these examples, you want to make sure you practice these. You want to make sure that you have someone who is in charge of making sure they're read aloud at each meeting, because it takes a while for these to be implemented. But this is a great tool to help build your team into an effective team. Has anyone used rules for the road or community agreements with their teams already?
I would say no. However, I think it's a good point to start off with, especially when you have a leadership team I feel like in a leadership team, I think these rules for the road can really help keep everyone to be held as leaders. If even, in my role, I'm a manager, I play the role of a management and leadership, and we all sit around a team as a leadership team, but we all are managers as well. So I think the rules for the road can definitely be helpful in just keeping everyone in place as to what role they're playing.
Yeah, and how to disagree with each other, right? And I can tell you that the do not have hallway conversations or private IM conversations, that one can be hard. And, depending on, you might have a new team member that joins it, and you may have to start all over again to kind of reiterate some of the rules, right? Or slightly tweak them if the wording isn't quite right for your team. But if we can say what needs to be said in the meeting, not afterwards with someone else, then you have built trust in a way that most teams have a hard time achieving. And trust is so critical for really, really good success. Okay, well, thank you. Let's go to the next one. So we're going to talk a little bit more about each one of them in the pyramid, just to kind of make sure that we touch on the highlights. Again, Patrick Lencioni has written a lot about effective teams and the dysfunctions of teams, if you're interested in reading more about him. So members of great teams, and what he talks about is they trust each other on a fundamental emotional level and are comfortable being vulnerable with each other about their weaknesses, mistakes, fears, and behaviors. Now, I don't know about all of you, but when I first started, I did not get any training as a manager or a leader. I was a direct service provider who was promoted to manager with no training from a Friday to a Monday. And I certainly didn't think that it was smart to be vulnerable or talk about my weaknesses or fears or mistakes, because I was worried that that would be seen as me not being ready, right? Or would I be punished? Or how would it reflect in my performance evaluation? And so this is not necessarily something that's easy to do, but the more you can think about sharing your weaknesses or kind of some of your fears, the better it is as a leader, because not only are you showcasing that we're all human, but you're also then looking at, well, if I'm not good at writing, which is not necessarily one of my strength suits, but I know, John is, then he can step up and say, hey, I can write if you can come up with the raw ideas. Or maybe someone is really good at working with case managers to get them onboarded, but somebody else is really good at writing the job descriptions. And again, so whatever it is that you may be good at, or I didn't used to be good at delegating, and so if I had somebody else who is good at delegating, then as a team, you can look at what are all the pieces that maybe that you have collectively that none of us will have individually. So, and the more you're kind of comfortable sharing that as a leader, as a manager, the better, because again, it also shows a level of confidence in yourself that will help the people that you supervise and your colleagues. Next one. So fear of conflict is another one. So I'm an immigrant, and when I first came to the US, the first time I met an Italian American, this person was very loud in my mind, used there a lot and was in my personal space. And I had, from my cultural background, I didn't know what to do with that. And I completely shut me down in terms of being able to dialogue back and forth, because I didn't know kind of what that was all about, right? And so I didn't know how to disagree. And I just didn't even share or try to kind of disagree, because I was afraid I was going to get in conflict with somebody, and I didn't kind of know what the rules were. So what you want here is you want to make sure that you as a team know what you're comfortable with in terms of pushing back on each other. So if I'm disagreeing with Caroline about something she said, how do I do that in a way that doesn't shut down the dialogue, but gets us to a place where we can air what it is that we're disagreeing on? Because if you get everybody's ideas and voice on the table and you kind of sort through all those ideas and opinions, you're going to get a better outcome in the long run. So we want to have dialogue around issues and decisions that are key to the agency's success. We shouldn't hesitate to disagree with one another, whether you're the boss or not, because we want to find the best answers. And the best way to do that is to get everybody's opinions and best, ideas on the table. And we don't want to not have those best ideas on the table because people are afraid of conflict. So you have to kind of come up with, again, the rules of the road. What are the rules of the road around disagreeing? And maybe the rule of the road is, well, I can say, Caroline, I disagree with you, but I'm not saying to Caroline, I can't believe you came up with that idea, because we're trying to stick to the topic. It's not anything with mean-spirited personal attacks. We never go there, and that's the rule. But we can say, I disagree with you, Caroline, because, and then come up with reasoning why and come up with a different solution. That could be the way that you handle the conflict. But fear of conflict is a huge barrier to having an effective team. If you go to the next slide. So what you'll see here is that if you don't get everybody's ideas or opinions or thoughts as part of, because of there's a fear of conflict, then not everyone is going to feel heard. And if I don't feel I've been heard, I don't feel I can be heard because of power, because somebody else has set a direction and I don't know how to disagree with them, or I'm new, or whatever it might be. If my voice haven't been heard, then it's harder for me to say, I did think that this idea about starting a new shelter was not a good idea, that we should go for permanent supportive housing instead. And, because I didn't share my opinion about that, I wasn't able to buy into the direction completely. If I had been heard, but then have been told, we heard you, Olivia, but we are going to go with a shelter direction because of X, Y, and Z, then at least I'll know that I was listened to and heard. And even though my idea wasn't chosen, then I know that I was heard. And so I'm going to commit to the decision the team makes, because I know I have been listened to, and I know that it has been considered, and I understand why it's not going in that direction. So I will commit to the direction because I feel I've been heard. Does that make sense? Okay, let's go to the next one. So if I've been heard, then I am going to be much more likely to support the group decision, even if it wasn't the direction that I wanted to go in. And I'm also much more likely to say, I'm going to help us collectively achieve the result that we decided on collectively. And I'm also going to work with our whole team. We're all going to, make sure that we all know exactly what it is we're supposed to be doing to achieve this goal. And this is all about accountability, because sometimes when we're in meetings, right, we might discuss some items, we might just discuss some decisions, but it isn't clear who's taken the next step or by when, right? So sometimes we leave meetings and it isn't completely clear. If you have a good solid foundation as a team, then in that team meeting, you can then say, hey, Teresa, I know that you discussed taking the following steps. Do you need help with that, or are you taking the next steps? And can we all agree to report on it at the next time we check in, right? So that we are all listening to each other, we're helping each other, we're stepping in for each other, because we don't also want to rely just on the leader as the primary source of accountability in teams. Often there is a boss, there is a leader, but we want to make sure that we distribute leadership as much as possible, because the more leadership you have at all levels of the organization, the more really innovative outcomes you're going to get. You don't want all the leadership to be just in one person. You want to evoke all the great ideas from as many people as possible. And you want teams to really work with each other to hold each other accountable, so it isn't all up to one person. And again, you can do this by addressing these dysfunctions. And then if you go to the next slide, you can see that if you then have teams that they do trust each other, they're not afraid to disagree in a constructive way, they have committed because they've been heard, they're holding each other accountable to do what they said they were going to do and to keep to deadlines, you are going to get the results that you set out to do. So that's really what this pyramid is all about. So I've talked a lot here, and I just wanted to open it up and see if you have any thoughts and reflections before we go to the next piece. No reflections at all from anyone? Tiandra, I think it's being recorded. Caroline, can you answer that question in terms of, is this shared?
Yes, the recording and the slides will be shared out after.
Great.
Livia, I wonder if you can address how to, once you have a healthy team, how to maintain that team with, I know a lot of our agencies have frequent turnover.
Yeah, such a good question. Yes. So one of the two strategies that we see a lot is that there are rules for the road that you create for yourself, and you commit to having them read at the beginning of each meeting. And you usually, what you do is you read them out loud, and you have, go around and have folks kind of read it, to take turns reading each one of them. And then you also have someone that you basically agree on is the one who will kind of help keep this at the forefront. So basically, you could have a standing agenda item that basically says, here is the pyramid that we are going to kind of just use as a weather bell, if you will, in terms of how are we doing. So at each meeting, kind of saying, hey, it seemed like we didn't actually do what we said we were going to do last time we met. Let's look at the pyramid and say, what's going on here in terms of, is there any one of these things that we need to pay attention to? Are we not trusting each other? Are we not, did we not hear from everyone? What's going on with people not committing to doing what they said they would do? So, and who actually pays attention to the results in terms of, is there an action plan where you're actually showing the wins? Because one way to kind of help teams stay on track too is to say, what are the wins, both short term and long term? And so we often have, as teams, to also have somebody who kind of can have this kind of pyramid and kind of ready to kind of say, can we just see kind of where is what's our dysfunction that we want to look at addressing today, just to normalize it. And then have someone else who is always looking at elevating the wins at each meeting, because we need to hear what's going well, because so much of the work we do is challenging, and we often don't take time to kind of hear the wins. So even if you have on your team, three different people who are in charge of three different things, the wins, the rules of the road, and this pyramid, those are tools to help these teams stay on track. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So we're going to shift a little bit to talk about key management functions and key leadership functions. And then we're going to do a quick poll to kind of see how you feel about each one of them in terms of where you're at, just so that you can get a sense of, I might need to think a little bit more about management or leadership. So key management functions, again, they really talk about the authors, it's a process with a social element. So when you're managing, you are really looking at all the resources that you have available. But the resources, of course, include people. And so that's why they talk about it as a social element. You're not just managing materials or a budget. You're providing guidance to people. So it's a process with a social element. And so we will get to, some of the traits that will be good for managers and leaders to have in just a little bit, because of this social element. What do you need to know in order to work with people, right? And because they talk about that in the literature as well. So broadly, management, and this is what we saw in the first slide too, it involves planning, organizing, leading and commanding, and controlling. And we're going to go through that just a little bit more. Okay, next slide. So planning is looking ahead and drawing up a good plan of action. And once you've done that, you implement it, you want to continue to monitor it and adjust it as needed. That seems pretty straightforward, but that it really is, what they talk about as planning. That is one way to think about it. We're going to talk about a few more things. So you may want to draw up a plan for your team in terms of how you want to meet a strategic priority for your agency. Maybe you are working to implement a training on motivational interviewing and how will you make sure all your staff are trained in that? And how will you make sure you have the needed resources and people can take time off for the training, et cetera, right? So you're planning all of that. And it also is about if you might have, budget responsibilities. And if you do, there's a whole different layer of planning in terms of how do you plan your budget? Who do you plan it with? And how do you make adjustments as needed? If you go to the next slide. So kind of in a nutshell, it's about thinking ahead so that your team knows what to do, when to do it, why it matters, and what's the process to adjust it if you need to adjust it as you go. When you develop a plan, whether it's a 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 month, or even a week-long plan, depending on the level of change or the things that you're managing, it would be good to get leadership buy-in and make sure that you keep everyone informed, right? So you want to, if you have to pivot, you want to make sure your leadership knows that why is this a priority right now? And then you keep communicating to your team what it is that you're working towards and why it matters, because it helps people when they're doing their day-to-day work to be reminded, yes, we are developing and implementing this new training. Yes, it's taking time away from, your working directly with people, but this is why it matters. This is what the outcome we're going towards. Because then it's easier to kind of say, all right, I'm doing more documentation in a record now. Why does it matter, that I need to document it? Well, because we can now get reimbursement from this funder if we document how many people we get into housing. I'm just making it up, but you see what I mean? If you know why you're doing something, it really helps people to keep doing it if they're not quite sure why we're doing it. You also want to make sure that, if you need to figure out that you need to add a whole new interim responsibility, who has the time, who has the skills, who's interested. So when I was working on Cape Cod, we were asked to house all the people who were landing in from Hurricane Katrina, because some of the planes landed on the Otis Air Force Base on Cape Cod, and they asked us to come in to house all the folks within 8 weeks. And as you can imagine, that was a huge pivot from providing housing and shelter to something completely different. And so you're planning on how to do that, and you have to figure out who's available, who has the time, who has the skills, right? And then as you get into then planning this, you also need to think about how do you delegate? And at a minimum, you want to be crystal clear about when does it need to get done and what does done look like? So when do you both agree that this has been completed? What are the quality standards? And then, of course, you want to make sure you're checking in with team members along the way. You may need to make small adjustments. If you go to the next one, again, you may or may not have budget responsibilities. And you may be managing entire budgets or pieces of it. And you may also be involved in creating budget proposals. If you do have that, it's a whole separate training for that, but it's really important that you understand what are your responsibilities, who you're doing with, who's approving it, how do you think about using your budget for various activities that you're in charge of. So it's a different training, but I just want to, we put it in here because a lot of managers do have budget responsibilities. And I think it's also important to mention that when you're planning, a lot of that happens independently. You're kind of trying to figure it out yourself. What needs to be done, who should do it, what's most important. And again, how will we know we've achieved it in the way we want to achieve it? And when does it need to be done by? But don't do it all by yourself. You want to make sure you get regular feedback from your supervisors, from the team. You want to make sure you make adjustments. So initially, it's good for you to plan, but then get feedback, get buy-in, because invariably your plan will be better if you get input from other people. Okay, so let's go to the next one. For organizing, which is another part of managing, some of these have overlap, but again, this is how the literature talks about it, it's the planning, the organizing. So organizing, again, it could be that you look at, what are the processes that you need to develop in order to achieve something, right? Or for your unit or your program area to run smoothly. What is it maybe that you need to do to figure out how long it will take to do something. And again, who can do it? We talked about that a little bit earlier, but this is the process to actually organize it, to calendar it out, to look at, who are the people that you may need to train, or how do you figure out the best tools to stay organized. So organizing is, again, how might you successfully onboard 2 new staff, who are coming on board within what staff have currently on their plate in terms of adding additional mentoring. So again, you're organizing it. So I won't go too much into this because it has a little bit of overlap with planning, but that's how they talk about this key management function. If you go to the next slide, we're going to talk about controlling. And controlling is sometimes a little harder for folks. Controlling or commanding or leading. This is where you're supervising, providing feedback to your team, your subordinates, both in their daily work and during challenging periods. So that means you both need to have confidence to lead in both situations. And what we often hear from folks is that I am a really good manager or leader when things are going well. I'm not so good when there's big conflicts or crisis. Other folks are saying, actually, I am really good in crisis situations, but ongoing supervision and providing I'm less good at, right? And so you need to think about, what's your growth edge as it relates to commanding and leading and doing that kind of supervision during challenging times or regular times. Leading is also about inspiring. And you also lead as a manager, right? And as a manager, when you are telling someone what to do, when you are giving them directives, you want to make sure that it's in line with your policies, with your culture, so that you are giving feedback, you are treating the subordinates in the way that you have been trained to and according to policies. And so one of the things that you might want to think about for housing is, what are the values in your employee manual in how subordinates should be treated by your managers and your leaders? And is there a way to reinforce that, to celebrate that when it happens well, or how do you address it if it isn't happening, right? Because leading and commanding is such an important part of key management as well. And so if you do have your values written up in how you're treating each other, how you're treating your subordinates, it might be a good tool to kind of think about, how do we make sure we stay true to our values? So if you go to the next one, so controlling is really keeping an eye on whether the work is being done and it matches what you planned and what the organization needs. Big picture. So if you think about what does it look like in practice, you want to make sure that your team what they're working on is lining up with the policies, the goals you set together, and where the company is going big picture. You want to think about just always checking, are things drifting off course? Deadlines slipping? Is the quality not quite right? Is the spending higher than expected? Are more hours being used? What's going on? So be on a, kind of look out for spotting problems early. And as soon as you can, try to take corrective action with the person first, if at all possible. Don't just report it. You want to do something about it. You want to make small adjustments before they become big ones. You want to address it early, and you want to normalize that this is part of most processes, most change, most carrying out work. We all have ways to improve what we do. Often we kind of go off track a little bit, and it's just normal to kind of go back in and say, hey, how's it going? It seems like you might have some trouble delegating. Let's talk about that. Or if you're you're in charge of budgets, you always want to keep an eye on where you're at with the budget. Are you spending on track? Are you using your resources wisely? And if that's not part of your responsibility, that wouldn't be in your lane. So if you go to the next one. So think about controlling like GPS navigation. You're putting in where you want to go. You're setting your destination. You're also getting your car ready. You're figuring out where, or your bus, you're figuring out who's going to sit where. You're organizing. And then you're driving the car or the bus. And then you keep watching the GPS to make sure you're still on the right route. You're rerouting when you're hitting unexpected traffic. So it isn't about being a quote unquote control freak. It is just to notice that, when do we need to take some course corrections and to make them quickly. Address them early and often so that it feels like it's something everybody's doing together. Okay, so we're going to take a poll. If you go to the next slide, the key management functions. So we just talked about the key management functions. If you go to the next one, the key management function we just discussed are planning, organizing, commanding, and leading. And rather than write out 2 functions you want to further develop, because that's what we would do if we had more time and we were in person, we're going to take a poll, and you're going to, in the poll, kind of just indicate which are the 2 that you feel that you need to develop, that you could improve on. Not that you're not doing a good job now, but we can always improve. Okay, go ahead, Caroline, please. All right, Caroline, do we have any choices yet?
Yes, we have about 16 people that have participated so far. I'll just give it a couple more seconds to see if anyone else would like to join, and then I'll go ahead and share the results.
Wonderful. Okay, so can everybody see the results?
Yes.
So you can see that for this group, for folks who did make a choice, it's pretty even in terms of, if you think about the team as a whole, the areas that folks feel that they may improve on. And that's good information for you to have as agency, right? Going, okay, maybe if it was really heavily on controlling or heavily on planning, you could look at, okay, maybe there's some specific trainings around that. But it's pretty distributed. So that means that it probably would be helpful to think about all of these pieces as it relates, especially to your managers, in terms of, are there ways, what are the specific things that folks are feeling in these 4 core areas that might be helpful to them to get some additional skill building around. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's go to the next slide on key leadership functions. So we talked about key management, and now we have, for the ones that you took yourself and wherever you landed on which management skills you want to develop, that's also good for you to think through with your supervisor. Hey, I really need to think more about how do I delegate, or how do I control, or how do I get some good planning tools, whatever it might be. Use that information with your supervisor to see if there's something you can do to tweak your skills or your tools you have in that area. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so we talked early on about key leadership being about establishing a direction, sharing a vision of the future, and the big picture strategies about how are you going to go about achieving. We want to get 20 more housing specialists, because 20 more landlords online, and we want to make sure that we have 100 more people housed every 3 months. So if just again, you're setting a vision, you're not saying exactly how, but you're coming up with some visions and some big strategies, right? So that's kind of what you think about it when you're establishing direction. A lot of us, when we're managing programs and people, and we're also doing leadership, we don't always have time to step back and think about the big picture, about where we want to go. And so we often talk to agencies about doing that, carving time out to say, let's step back, even if it's a half a day. Let's step back. Let's turn off all the kind of the cell phones, make sure you have coverage, and can we think about, big picture. And then once you have that, again, this is the direction we're going in. And we need to think about, who is it that we can have, that we need to have help cooperate with us. It could be external or it could be internal stakeholders, right? And who are some teams that we need to put in place if they're not already there? That may be a mix of different centers to really understand the vision, where we're going, and come up with a plan to get us there. And then who is it that's going to kind of help us keep energizing people? Because, you're going to start a new maybe the neighbors are very upset about that, right? So what are the barriers? It could be neighborhoods, it could be political, bureaucratic. What are the barriers that you need to just recognize in terms of how do you motivate and inspire people to keep going as a leader? Not that you necessarily are going to address all the barriers alone as a leader. That's not the point, but you're going to recognize that there will be barriers and you want to think about inspiring and keeping people going. And again, leadership is about producing change where management is about predictability and order. So if you go to the next slide, John Cotter again from Harvard, he talks about leadership fundamentally being about establishing direction and creating a vision. He talks about the 7 qualities of effective leadership: having and inspiring a shared vision, leading, not managing. A lot of leaders, if they get into managing, and it's important if you're setting direction and you're a leader that you think about, leading and not managing, and especially if you're not good at it, and having someone else to do that. Who is it, right? Quote. So you want a connection of others. So again, effective leadership is about valuing the contribution of others. As a leader, you're never the only one with good ideas. You want to hire the right people. You want to give them as much trust and responsibility as you can to give them their job. You don't want to necessarily micromanage them. You want to provide feedback, but you also want to earn folks' trust, right? And you want to over communicate, and you want to make sure that you provide personal development or have the resources for personal development for people to carry out their jobs. So this is what he talks about in terms of what leaders really do. If you go to the next slide, please. He also talks about what does it actually take to transform? And this is good to know if you are a leader and you're trying to come from a current place to a whole new vision. And if you want to transform, you want to say, well, why is this important? So create a sense of urgency. If we don't come up with a way to house the folks who have been, asked to be removed from their encampments before winter, then it's going to be a crisis on our hands, right? You want to create a sense of urgency. You want to build a coalition of folks who, whether either internally or externally, that is committed to this, who is willing to work with you in the trenches. You want to have a clear vision about where you're going and some of the main kind of priorities or initiatives. You want to make sure you have other people on your transformation team who's going to help you, who agree with your vision. And you want to not just take action, you want to also look at, are there barriers that I can remove easily? And if I don't have my key team players, I want part of it, what can I do to free up their time so they can participate fully? You're removing a barrier rather than taking action necessarily. You want to think about short-term wins to inspire people. You want to have someone who can really help think about how do you keep going once you set a direction, because sometimes when you do a strategic planning and you set a vision, you can't always sustain the momentum. You really want to have a team in place that is responsible for this, that's eager, that pays attention to the health of that team. And then you want to think about, once you've achieved it, your vision, how do you keep institutionalizing what you have accomplished so that you don't fall back? So that's what he talks about in terms of 8 steps to transformation. And if you go to the next slide, this is one of my favorite slides. If you're in the middle of a transformation effort, if you're leading, you're trying to get to a certain vision, you're trying to achieve a vision, but it's kind of not coming, together, and you can't quite figure out what's going on. This is a nice little cheat sheet. And it really talks about the necessary ingredients for successful change. So if you look at the bottom where it says vision, if you have a vision, if you know where you're going, if you have the skills on your team, so if you have all the people with all the skills to get there, if you have the incentives, both that it's in terms of, yes, I have time, I'm getting compensated, it's something that's important to me. If you have the incentives in place, if you have the resources, again, it can be the budget, it can be time, you have somebody else stepping in to take on some responsibilities. And if you have an action plan, you will get change. If any one of those is missing, then what happens, for example, in the first line where it starts with skills plus incentives and resources and action plan, you may have all the skills on your team. You may have good incentives in place, all the resources and budget, and you may have an action plan. But if people don't know where you're going and what you're trying to achieve, there's going to be confusion. In the second line, you can see you have the vision in place, You have the incentives. People are eager to get there. They are behind you in where you want to go with your vision. You have the resources. People have been compensated for the time. They're being paid to be there. They don't have to worry about some of the other jobs, and there's an action plan. But there isn't the needed skills. The team may not know how to get there. They may not how to, do I get the budget? How do I start a new program? So if the skills aren't there, that can produce anxiety. In the third line, you can see you have the vision, you know where you're going. The skills are there in terms of, people know how to do it. They have the resources, an action plan, but the incentives are not clear. Sometimes we get asked to be on meetings to help do some stuff, but it's, what's in it for me? Why is this important to me? Am I, the incentive is not really there for me. And often, if you can have a person participate who both, achieves a goal of their own in addition to the agency goals, then that's a win-win. The incentives are clear. This will get more people housed from my agency. It will help me develop as a leader in terms of knowing how to start a new program. The incentives are clear, right? So without those incentives, it's not that you're not going to get change, but they talk about getting gradual change. So it may be going slower. So it may be that you want to look at the incentives part of, if you're seeing gradual change. If you have vision, skills, incentives, but not the right resources, if you don't have the budget, if you have to do this in addition to your full-time job and you're not doing it after hours, you're going to be frustrated, right? And so if there's frustration here, then you want to look at why is the frustration. And then if you have the vision, skills, incentives, resources, but no action plan, how do I get there? Then you're going to get a lot of false starts. So this is just a good one to print out. And Julio, I see your chat. Thank you. Then this is just a good one to kind of look at going, this is going harder than it should. What might be missing in terms of a necessary ingredient? Any questions about this one? Okay. So then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about what do you need to think about as a leader in terms of kind of some of the internal work we have to do. Not just that, but let's go to the next slide, please. So Robert Kaplan talks about managing oneself. And he did some work in 2011 to talk about, what is it that I need to ask myself as a leader? And he has like 3 main areas in this triangle, and we're going to just touch on some of them to give you a sense of the importance of developing yourself as a manager or a leader or both. So he says, if I am a leader, how often am I actually sharing my vision and my goals to my team? Do they know kind of where I'm going and where I think we should go as a team or as an agency? And do they know the key action steps that we've identified to meet those goals? Or have I kind of not communicated that clearly, right? And do I share why certain goals and actions are important? And then one of the little tests that he says to do is, if someone was to come ask any one of my employees, would they be able to articulate where we're going, the goal, why we're doing it, and the priorities? And if not, then you probably haven't communicated it clearly enough. And then as a leader, am I actually spending the time that I have to help me achieve my priorities? Or am I doing other stuff that may be less important, but still, and it might be more busy work? So he talks a little bit about the importance of really qualifying and prioritizing your goals, because you don't want to send confusing messages to employees about your true priorities. They need to see you focusing on the priorities you have set as well as a leader. You don't want to say, I want you all to do X, Y, and Z, and then not, do that yourself. If you're coming up with a new vision, they need to see it's important to you as well. So that's, one area of this triangle is that does the way you spend your time match the key priorities you have laid out for yourself and your team and that you've articulated? If you go to the next slide, you also want to take the time to learn about the people you supervise and lead. What motivates people you supervise? how do each one of them best learn? What's the best way to give feedback? Am I really invested? It can be hard to know what motivates people if you don't ask them. So you might want to ask them, hey, what really gets you excited about doing this work? What's your why? Why are you doing this? Because I want to understand that. Because as a leader, you want to be able to engage and influence people to achieve the results and get their best feedback. And how they best learn, some of us need to be shown, some of us like to read, some of us like to do both, some of us need to apply and be able to make mistakes and come back, right? So how do people best learn? And take some time to really think about that is a good use of your time for your team that you supervise. Some folks don't give their subordinates timely and direct feedback. I know for me, early on, it was hard for me to give direct feedback because I didn't want to quote unquote hurt their feelings when I first started out. But I also realized that if I'm not giving them feedback, then well, how will they know if they're doing a good job or not, if they're learning a whole new skill, right? And if I'm doing it in a timely way rather than 2 weeks later, then it's more apt to be helpful because they can apply it right away, right? So timely and direct in a way that people can hear it. Of course, it has to be professional. It has to be person-centered. But how do I best do that? And often when we meet with new supervisees, we ask them, hey, how would you like to utilize feedback? Or how do you supervision? How do I best work with you? And some folks will say, don't micromanage me. Just tell me what to do and let me try it and let me come to you. Other people will say, I really want you to give me direct feedback because show me how to do it exactly how you want me to do it. Give me feedback if you see, because I need it reiterated a couple of times. So it's a good discussion to normalize and to have with your team and the people you supervise, right? And then, are you invested? Sometimes we get burned out. Sometimes we need to take a break. Sometimes we have too much on our plate. Sometimes we're not really quite believing in where we're going as an agency. But it's really important to ask, okay, am I invested? Because you want to be there for the people that you supervise, right? In order to achieve the results you want to be. And if not, what support may you need? And that's something that's important to pay attention to as a leader. And I think something that we don't pay enough attention to, because we all are humans as well, and we'll also need support so we can stay invested and excited. So if you go to the next one. So emotional intelligence, not only about yourself, but also others, is another trait that Robert Kaplan talked about developing. You want to think about, how aware are you of yourself in terms of, what stresses you out? What are you good at? What do you need to improve? All those things. It's good to have good self-awareness. There's a lot to this. This is just very, very high level. But you also want to be able to kind of say, okay, self-regulation. What are the ways that you can calm yourself or that you can get the support you need if you are feeling stressed or anxious or uncertain? Maybe you've been asked to do something you actually don't know how to do and you don't know how to ask for help, or you don't want to ask for help because you don't want to appear vulnerable. If you know about, and so your nervous system is starting to produce chemicals, or you're feeling all kind of anxious and you're actually getting a little paralyzed, how are ways that you can think about getting the training or awareness so that you can actually regulate some of that? What is the support you need? What is it in the environment that stresses you? Maybe it's not the right fit for the job you're doing. Maybe some of the pieces you just need to know the skills. But whatever it is, how do you self-regulate? Because as leaders, we never want to take it out on the people we supervise or on our teams, right? So how do you self-regulate? Motivation, again, what motivates you? What motivates the people you work with? Again, we talked about that earlier. It's just an important thing to spend some time on. And empathy, and empathy is all about understanding that we all may have circumstances that impact our ability to show up fully in our day-to-day work. And we want to be mindful of that. And as an agency, we want to think about how do we support the wellness of our employees, right? Because we want to make sure that our staff can do the job that they were hired to do and do it well and carry out their responsibilities. So empathy is important so that you're not seeing folks just as a unit or someone that you can just, yell at to get them to do things. And again, it's really about understanding a little bit about why motivate them, and then still saying, hey, what is it that you can do, and to make sure you can carry out your job responsibilities, and what is it that we need to know as an agency so we can support you, because we are person-centered, but we are also a business. So that line is always important to talk about and normalize in supervision. And then social skills. Not all of us have good social skills. And what is it that you can improve upon in terms of your social skills? And it could be that you're maybe talking too much, could be that you talk too little, could be that you don't always know what to talk to people about. It could be, how do I handle, social events at my agency? Some people love get-togethers, others don't like them at all. So where am I at? And again, this is for you to develop deeper knowledge of yourself so that you can be the best leader and manager in your agency. Okay, so we're going to take one more poll here. So of the leadership qualities, which of these do you feel that you could benefit from developing? Having an inspiring and shared vision, leading, not managing, valuing the contribution of others, hiring the right people, providing feedback, or communication. All right, Caroline, I'll let you post it whenever you feel it's ready.
Sure, we've got about 13 responses so far, so just give it a few more seconds and see if anyone else has anything to add.
All right, so it has been posted, and I love this too, right? So which ones you chose are, again, good for you to really think about. Okay, I learned a little bit about leadership and management, and I know that there are some things that I can probably look at getting better at. And having an inspiring, a shared vision, it did come in for more than half of you, as did hiring the right people, allowing them to do their job. And, those qualities are indeed so important. And John Cutter and Robert Copeland would both agree that those are critical in terms of being leaders. Hiring the right people it's not always an easy thing either, right? So you might have to look at, okay, what's our onboarding process? How do we post our job descriptions? What's our promotion kind of, do we promote from within always? And does that mean that we may not always get the right candidate? Or what do we make sure we put in place for training for that internal candidate to have the skills they need? And then sharing a vision. Some of us are better at thinking big and bold and strategic visions than others. And how do we build some of those skills? How do I think about setting a vision? And there's training just on that. And then how do I actually get excited about that and share that excitement with others? So these are all really good kind of just is feedback for yourself, right? And providing feedback and earning trust. Yes, for me, that's always something I work on, even now after many years in the field. And leading, not managing, that one is it's harder sometimes when you're in leadership position and you come to that leadership position from a management position. You tend sometimes to default to managing more than stepping into a leading role, depending on your position. So I love that some of you thought that might be something to pay attention to as well, because especially if you're promoted into a leadership position, we need to really think about how do we look at those leadership qualities. All right. So any questions, any concerns, anything you want me to go over again?
I actually I have a question, because it feels like so often when we put up a job description, we'll get like just the same like stock responses from people on Indeed, or like not Indeed. What is it? Idealist. And yes, Indeed. That's the other job
Indeed.
site we use. Do y'all have any other suggestions for where to find talent? Like, we share out our listings with community partners. like most of the obvious stuff, I think, but like I don't know if anybody's got particular tree they like to shake more than others.
More than others. Is this for all levels within your agency or for certain levels?
Entry level.
Entry level, yeah. And do you feel that your job description, job posting is really clear in terms of what you're looking for, responsibilities? Do you think it's more the job description or where it gets posted, or is it both?
I mean, the job descriptions are pretty clear.
Okay. Yep.
We get feedback from sitting staff on the job descriptions, and we go through that every so often
Yeah.
there. So
I think, one of the things we know from this industry, of course, is that I don't know what your levels of pay is,
Yeah.
but we do know from other states that housing and behavior health, a lot of folks are in a way turning away from it because it feels like it's less competitive than other industries. We're seeing a little bit of some chatter that might be changing, so that you might get higher quality candidates, if you will, quote unquote, and from in the future. But it is an issue we've heard again and again in terms of where to post it. I actually, Caroline, what we can do, Rush, is we can share where we send ours, but just to see if there's anything else that might pop up for you. Although we are training, we're not direct service anymore. But let me think about that for a minute with our chief operating officer, because we've spent some time on that as well. Because when you have entry folks coming in, you also need to be mindful of what is your onboarding and training process, right? And so sometimes it's that, and it's also being very clear about, what our expectations are, what our culture is, and what our feedback is, right? That, hey, we're going to give you 3 months and 6 months into, kind of evaluation, because we want to make sure that you're the right fit, and you're happy and we're happy, and really being crystal clear about going through that job description within the first, 30 days and 60 days, and setting those expectations and not letting folks necessarily go out on their own, if you will, or kind of, in the beginning. Because if you can be more intentional in the beginning, sometimes it gets better in the long run than the other way around. Kind of saying, let's see what you can do and then we'll tweak. No, do the opposite. Kind of be very intentional, kind of micromanage daily meetings, figuring out, what are the questions, where, what are all the stumbling blocks, and very early catch it if it's not a good candidate.
Oh yeah, that catching it early. I definitely echo that.
Yeah, I know it's I hear you. It's a little bit of a conundrum.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Of course. Anyone else? All right. Well, you all do such important work. It's been a pleasure to talk about this with you. There are always lots of things you can read up on leadership and management. There's no shortage of research, so I hope this has been helpful just for some of this, some initial kind of introduction to all of this. And I see, Caroline, you have put in the evaluation links. So I think that's what I have for me. I'm sorry for any glitches in internet. Can't control that.
Thank you for your time, and thank you everybody that was able to participate today.
Thank
We will
you.
be sending out the slides as well with links to the training evaluation.